I'm Patrick Lannan from the Lannan Foundation, and better keep my glasses on. I have a little script here. It's not too well organized, but I want to thank all of you for coming tonight, and I want to say that it's a pleasure for us to be able to do co-sponsor an event with Haymarket Books, and I'll tell you why in a second. I'd also like to take advantage of the fact that there, well, first, I don't want to forget, there are people here from Taos. Where are they? Good going. Thanks for coming. In Albuquerque, there's a, wow. Thank you all. It's really great to have you. I'm going to use this occasion because you're all here to tell you that the Foundation is going to start a series called the Lannan Cultural Freedom Lecture Series here in Santa Fe. And I'm not sure exactly where we're going to have all the events. Some may be here, some may be at the School for the Deaf, some may be at the Armory of the Arts, and some may be at the Lenzing, depending on the subject and the speaker. And I just want to mention we're going to cover things like economic issues, which are on everybody's mind today, corporate graft, government corruption, human rights, civil liberties, the militarization of our foreign policy, environmental issues, immigration, Islamophobia. I'm just trying to go through we're putting this all together now, various Native American issues, global food issues, things like targeted assassination programs, and all the constitutional connections with that. Things, we're going to talk about public education, corporate-controlled media. I think hopefully it'll be an interesting series, and there'll be a lot of interest in the community. All of the events will be videotaped, and will be up on our website within about a week, and we'll offer them to iTunes and any other organization or website that wants to see them. So you're all welcome when it starts. And I think we'll be able to make some announcements, more specific announcements about the initial events in January sometime. So stay tuned. Haymarket Books is a nonprofit progressive book distributor and publisher. And their name and their inspiration comes from their namesakes, the Haymarket Martyrs. You can see their memorial in Chicago. In 1886, there was a big struggle for the 8-hour day, and ultimately May Day, which is celebrated in many parts of the world, not so much here, came out of that struggle and those deaths. You know, these same struggles are continuing today across the globe against oppression and exploitation, hunger, poverty, all the things that you're familiar with from reading the papers and listening to the news. I also want to mention that Haymarket Books some books are going to be for sale outside at the end of this event, and also there's an interesting catalog of their books that'll be available. Now, I have to say something nice about Anthony Arnove, who is an associate of ours and a wonderful person. Anthony recently directed and produced The People Speak with Howard Zinn, Chris Moore, Josh Brolin, and Matt Damon. And I don't know how many people have seen the film yet, the documentary, but it's really quite incredible. This documentary is a film companion to Howard Zinn's best-selling book, A People's History of the United States, and its primary source, which is The Voices of the People's History, which Arnove co-edited with Zinn, and he himself has written several books, including The Essential Chomsky, Iraq Under Siege, The Deadly Impact of Sanctions and Terrorism and War, and he also edited a collection of post-9/11 interviews with Zinn. He's also the author of Iraq, The Logic of Withdrawal. He is also on the editorial board of Haymarket Books and the International Socialist Review magazine. And with Zinn, he co-founded the nonprofit Voices of a People History of the United States, which is an effort to bring the program and the productions into school systems in the United States and other parts of the world. So please join me in welcoming Anthony Arnove, your host.
Patrick, and thanks to everyone from the Lannan Foundation. It's been such a privilege to work with the Lannan Foundation and to have the opportunity to work with them on a number of programs. I owe them a lot, including my current relationship comes out of a Lannan event with Arundhati Roy in New York City in the year, I guess it was 2003. It's really no exaggeration to say there's no other foundation, even remotely like the Lannan Foundation, in terms of the voices they've supported, the courageous positions they've taken, and the kind of support that they've given to Haymarket Books, which, as a small nonprofit publisher, I can tell you there's not a lot of people lining up to support independent publishing, the book, the written word in this country. And it really means a lot. Ilan Pappe would not be here tonight, would not be going to Houston, would not be going to New York if it wasn't for their support. And I can say that about a lot of other authors and a lot of other people. And they're also just wonderful people who embody the principles that they support. I'll just mention briefly that another Haymarket Books author who they're bringing to Santa Fe, and we're really thrilled about, is Tom Engelhardt, who will be here in February. And I believe the first Saturday in January, tickets go on sale for that event. I hope you can attend that as part of the Readings in Conversation series. He'll be here with Jeremy Scahill, who's another Haymarket author. We publish his book, Blackwater, in Spanish, and it's tough publishing in Spanish in this country, but it's an important and growing audience, and we're really thrilled that we were able to bring that and some other books to the Spanish-speaking community and reading community in this country. As we came in tonight, Ilan and Lori Betlock and we saw there's a quote in the lobby, "We cannot escape history." And I thought that was a tremendously fitting quote to see with regard to the presentation we're going to hear tonight from Ilan Pappe. His work really is a tribute to that sentiment, that we cannot escape history, that we have to confront it, that we have to understand it, that we have to engage with it, and we have to do so honestly, no matter what the price you may personally pay for it. Ilan Pappe is now the head of a Center for Palestine Studies that he founded at Exeter in England, but that institution, which is now really the first Western institution dedicated to the study of Palestine studies based at a university, and it's beginning to inspire other efforts. Columbia University, and I hope many more universities will follow in his footsteps. That choice came about partly as a result of him being kicked out of the university where he was teaching in Israel, because he understood that we cannot escape history, and in his scholarship he was willing to pursue a series of questions wherever they led him, and no matter what the personal price he might have to pay for writing and documenting the stories that he did. I was really reminded, spending the last few days with Ilan, of a passage from an essay by Arundhati Roy called The End of Imagination. And in The End of Imagination, Arundhati at the end talks about some principles that she hopes to live up to in her life. And I'll just quote briefly from it. She says, "To never get used to the unspeakable violence and the vulgar disparity of life around you. To never simplify what is complicated or complicate what is simple." And I think really that describes Ilan's work. He's willing to acknowledge the complexities of the issues he describes, but he's also, when it comes to moral issues, prepared to accept that sometimes things are rather simple, and that there's injustice, and that you need to take a stand against it. So it's really my privilege to welcome here tonight Ilan Pappe.
Thank you, Anthony, for your kind words. to thank the Lannan Foundation for bringing me over here. Thank you all tonight for coming and attending what I hope will be an engaging event. I'll start by reading a few sections from the book before Anthony and I would move into a conversation. I'm not used to reading from books. I'm used to speaking without notes, actually. But as Anthony taught me, this is a respect for the written word event. So I hope I would remember to stick to the text and remind myself that this is my own text, so it's not that bad if I do this. But if you see my eyes going up, it means that I'm making up things, as my enemies like to accuse me of, and they're probably right. A few words on the book, and then I'll delve into some readings. A young journalist by the name of Frank Barat had the idea a few months ago, almost a year ago actually, to juxtapose Noam Chomsky and myself on certain issues, as it became clear that Noam Chomsky's views on Palestine were challenging some of the new initiatives taken by Palestinians on the ground and the exilic communities. I know that you met one of these Palestinians here in New Mexico, Ali Abu Nima. We thought it would be good to air these views, first out of respect to Noam, of course, more than anything else, but also because we think the debate can move on, maybe beyond some of the things that he believed in. And he was a very willing partner for this, which shows his greatness. We basically focused on, I would say, 4 issues. And I would not be able to read about all these issues tonight, and I hope some of these issues would come out in the conversation. The first one had to do with how do we understand American support for Israel, to put it simply, or the American policy towards the Arab-Israeli conflict. That was one source of debate. The second one had to do with the issue of boycotting the Israeli academia, or the campaign for the cultural and academic boycott of Israel. We had different views about it, and I hope that the book brings out very clearly the 2 positions, but also the complexities of both positions. They're not straightforward anyway. And the third one has to do with the right of return of the Palestinian refugees. We have different innuendos. I wouldn't say that these are 2 strongly opposed opinions, but they're different. And they reflect, I think, a very important debate within the community of activists who support the Palestine issue around the world. And finally, and maybe most importantly, but I would leave that maybe for the conversation, we'll not read about it, is our vision for the future. What most activists nowadays call the one-staters against the two-staters, or the one-state solution for Palestine and Israel, or the two-state solution. But again, I think this sort of simple terms cover a more complex ideas about how best intellectuals can engage in solutions for people in a situation where, anyway, a solution seems so far ahead that one wonders whether it is at all the right time to talk about these things. And yet, I think that's what we are expected to do as part of the chattering and writing classes. Okay. The first chapter I'm going to read from is about my understanding of American policy towards the issue of Israel and Palestine. My main argument, and by this I'm very much influenced by the French philosopher Michel Foucault, is that history is made out of discrete processes that have very little in common. And then when they fuse together, they create what we call an historical event. But historians cannot describe this. They don't have enough words and enough flexibility to write something so chaotic. So what they do, they invent a very neat story so as to make it clear to themselves and to others. And I think that is also true about American policy. On the face of it, it looks like it was always pro-Israel, and it could never be pro-Palestinian. I claim in this chapter that this is not true, either the first part of the sentence nor the second one. It's called Clusters of History. A thought-provoking article was published by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt. Based on extended research, it discussed the power of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, the Israeli lobby in Washington, in shaping American policy in the Middle East in general and towards Israel in particular. The basic argument was that the lobby directs American policy in a way that undermines the United States national interest. Not since the 1960s would one have come across such a harsh criticism of either Zionism or U.S. policy from within the heart of the American academia or the media. The role of the lobby in shaping American policy in the Middle East is undoubtedly crucial, but American policy in the Middle East, like any regional policy of a great power in the past, is the outcome of more than one factor. For those like myself, for whom the analysis of such a policy is not just an academic, but a matter of life and death, an expanded analysis is called for, not only for the sake of understanding that policy more clearly, but also as a way of coping with its dangerous outcomes. As a historian by profession, I hope that seeing the development of this policy in a wider historical perspective may help those of us who live in the area and in Palestine to better comprehend what one may or may not do vis-à-vis such a powerful factor in our daily lives, one that is likely to remain so in the foreseeable future. A scholarly narrative of chaotic historical processes, such as the development of a particular foreign policy, requires an organizational method that might raise suspicions about a considerable gap between the structured representation of the policy and its actual implementation on the ground. This gap stems from the modern historiographical impulse to, in the words of Hayden White, organize reality with the same clarity as a novelist seeking to construct a lucid world in which a plot has a clear beginning and an end. Historiography is a constructive effort that is meant to expose the past as it really was, if we believe in such a possibility, or for the sake of making a contemporary point, if we doubt that possibility. But anyone who dares to dive into the ocean of words to be found in the political and diplomatic documents in the various national archives understands how precarious is the story extracted from these heaps of documents, left behind by the chattering classes that shaped our lives over the last 2 centuries. Technically, mapping a clear narrative out of the paperwork requires reliance on only a very small number of documents, chosen according to the subjective preference of the historian and not according to any objective criterion. A middle ground between relativist and positivist views of foreign policy historiography consists of providing readers interested in a particular chapter of such a policy with clusters of facts and evidence from the past, each providing a certain insight into the phenomenon being researched. In this article, which follows the history of the American involvement in the Middle East in general, and in Palestine in particular, the clusters, when fused together, can supply an expanded explanation for this policy. Any attempt to focus on one cluster alone is problematic, as Mearsheimer and Walt learned from criticism directed at them by friends and foes alike. In what follows, there is an attempt to expand the historical panorama and present 5 clusters of facts and contexts. These are actually 5 legacies that feed into American policy in the Middle East today. At first, these processes developed discreetly, but at a certain historical juncture, they met and fused into one powerful impulse that formulated American policy in this area. Now, one cluster, which I will not read about, and I beseech you to read if you do buy the book, is Christian Zionism. The reason I'm not reading about it is because I've talked so much about it lately that I'm boring myself with it. But I call it in the article, I call it the Blackstone-Scofield legacy. Those of you who are familiar a little bit with evangelist history in the United States, these two names should be familiar to you. Then there is another legacy I'm not reading from, the King Crane legacy. This is a very important legacy of the Arabists in the State Department who actually wanted American policy to be far more pro-Palestinian than it ever was. And these people still exist. Then you have the legacy of the AIPAC, of the pro-Jewish, pro-Zionist lobby in America. And I just want to read a small extract which describes how, in fact, AIPAC was born. I don't know how many people know this story, how AIPAC came into being and why it came into being. And here is that particular extract. In January 1953, it seemed that for a moment, Eisenhower wanted to renew American activism over the Palestine refugee issue. He was heard more than once talking about the need to allow their repatriation. Moreover, unlike his predecessor, Truman, Eisenhower distinguished between the American need to provide humanitarian aid to the refugees in their camps and adherence to principled American support for their right of return. His Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, visited the area and reported that allowing the return of refugees was still physically possible. Even in Congress, the possibilities of resettlement on both sides of the River Jordan were discussed in earnest. President Eisenhower judged that the problem of 300,000 refugees could be solved in such a way. But the Arab world did not endorse the plan, and Israel rejected it, both because of its element of return and, more importantly, because it conflicted with the aim of exploiting the Jordan River for the National Carrier Project of supplying water to Israel. The work on the National Carrier Project led to an angry response by the American president, who suspended aid to Israel, pending an end to the diversion of water from the Jordan River that Israel had begun in September 1953. Israel waited for a friendlier administration. This somewhat critical stance was maintained by the United States, and the Suez Crisis in 1956 led yet again to a threat of sanctions, American sanctions, in response to an aggressive Israeli policy. Who would believe that we would use such words today? Thus, in a matter of 7 years, Israel was thrice threatened with American sanctions. The Americans forced the Israelis out of the Sinai, which was a traumatic lesson for the local leadership. The prospect of such an American position expanding and deepening constituted in the eyes of the Israeli policymakers a real existential threat. This was definitely the opinion of Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, Abba Eban. As part of his efforts to sabotage such a development, he enlisted an official of Canadian origin who worked in the United Nations Public Relations Office, Isaiah L. C. Kennan. Kennan's first assignment was to write an article alerting the public to the dangers incurred by the anti-Israeli orientation of U.S. policy in the Middle East. The same message was forcefully conveyed in a series of articles Kennan published in a new journal, The Near East Policy, which became the pro-Israeli lobby's mouthpiece, funded partly by Israel. Kennan began organizing Jewish support, first in local trade unions and then in communities across the country. The Washington Institute for Near East Policy was founded around the journal as AIPAC's think tank. The first visible results of Kennan's activity was by Jewish members of the Dockers Union who boycotted Arab ships in in American harbors in order to prevent U.S. aid reaching Arab states that did not recognize Israel. Then came, around 1960, the first many Jewish initiatives on Capitol Hill for anti-Arab legislation. The pro-Israeli lobby worked uninterrupted until 1963, when the famous Senator William Fulbright became intrigued by its activities and demanded a congressional investigation of its financial sources. The 300 pages produced by the investigating body revealed that over 4 years, the lobby had raised $5 million, exempted from tax, from the Jewish community in the United States. This was done by the purchase of bonds clandestinely made over to the State of Israel. American law forbade lobbying for the interests of a foreign country. In order to overcome the legal prohibition, it was stated that the bonds were procured only for welfare purposes in Israel. However, the investigating committee found that none of the money was ever delivered to the deprived citizens of Israel. The money went to the Israeli state and from there immediately back to the United States, directly into AIPAC's bank account. In Newsweek, on August the 12th, 1963, it was written that the investigation exposed the AIPAC lobby as, and I quote, one of the most effective networks of foreign dominance in the United States. The result was the ruin. They succeeded in undermining Senator Fulbright's political career. In no time, they destroyed him politically as a result of this kind of activity. I continue and describe other legacies, which I will not go into it, but the bottom line is that when you fuse together these, what I call discrete historical processes, in the case of American policy, Christian Zionism, AIPAC, other legacies, you get what you have today. And let me just read what you get today, and I'm referring actually, when I say today, to something that happened a few years ago, but I'm sure it's relevant for 2010 as well. Of all these historical clusters, it is the bottom line that is definitive, displayed in great strength at the AIPAC Annual Convention of 2005. In the Washington Congress Center, 26,000 kosher meals were prepared, decorated with 32,640 hors d'oeuvres, 5 tons of salmon, 2.5 tons of turkey, 1 ton of poultry, and 1 ton of hummus. It was enough to feed the 5,000 participants. This culinary feast is only matched by one other event in Washington, the annual joint meeting of the two houses of Congress. The list of guests is similar to both events. Another bottom line can be shown not in tons, but in dollars. Since 1949, the United States has passed to Israel more than $100 billion in grants and $10 billion in special loans. Other bodies not part of the administration annually transferred to Israel $1 billion. This is larger than the amount of money transferred by the United States to North Africa, South America, and the Caribbean put together. Their joint population amounts to over 1 billion people. Israel's population is 7 million. Over the last 20 years, $5.5 billion has been given to Israel for military purchases. There is no precedent for such bilateral relations, and one does not have to overstate the implication of such a policy for the Palestinians and for the chances of peace in the Middle East. But in this historical narrative, there are also rays of hope. In the complex reality that formulates the American policy, there are factors and processes that in the past directed it into a more positive track. And it may be that history, as Michel Foucault tried to convince us, is a list of discrete, disconnected processes whose joint impact is not linked to any one of them, but to their fusion into one big explosion. In that case, history is not just a linear movement of endless American support to Israel against and at the expense of the Palestinian cause, but a more distorted, curved line of ups and downs that indicate possible changes in the future. Moreover, a concerted effort to bring about such a change is a worthy goal, inside and outside the United States. But what we have this year is the ominous call that already was made at 2006 AIPAC Convention for the United States to attack and invade Iran. Another chapter in this book deals with another kind of history, the history of denial, not just the history of American policy. And it's called State of Denial, the Nakba, that is the Palestinian catastrophe, in Israeli history and today. For Israelis, 1948 is a year in which two things happened that contradict each other. On one hand, Zionism, the Jewish national movement, claimed it fulfilled an ancient dream of returning to a homeland after 2,000 years of exile. From this perspective, 1948 was a miraculous event in the collective Israeli Jewish memory. It constitutes a chapter in history that not only proclaims triumph and the realization of dreams, but also carries associations with moral purity and absolute justice. This is why anything that happened in that year is wedded to the most basic values of present Israeli society. Hence, the military conduct of the Jewish soldiers on the battlefield in 1948 became a model for generations to come. And the leadership statesmanship in those years is still a paragon for future political elites. The leaders are described as people devoted to the Zionist ideals and as men who disregarded their private interests and good for the sake of the common cause. 1948, then, is a sacred year, revered in more than one way as the formative source of all that is good in the Jewish history of Israel. On the other hand, 1948 also marked the worst chapter in Jewish history. In that year, Jews did in Palestine what Jews had not done anywhere else in the previous 2,000 years. Even if one puts aside the historical debate about why what happened in 1948 in fact transpired, no one seems to question the enormity of the tragedy that befell the indigenous people of Palestine as a result of the emergence and success of the Zionist movement. Jews expelled, massacred, destroyed, and raped in that year, and generally behaved like all the other colonialist movements operating in the Middle East and Africa since the beginning of the 19th century. In normal circumstances, as Edward Said recommended in his seminal Culture and Imperialism, painful dialogue with the past should enable a given society to digest both the most evil and the most glorious moments of the nation's history. But this could not work in the case where a moral self-image is considered to be the principal asset in the battle for public opinion, and thus the best means of surviving in a hostile environment. The way out for the Jewish society in the newly found state was to erase in the collective memory the unpleasant chapters of the past and leave intact the gratifying ones. It was a conscious mechanism put in place and motion in order to solve the impossible tension arising from the two contradictory messages of the past. Moreover, the fact that so many of the people in Israel today lived through the 1948 period has made the task all the more difficult. 1948 is not a distant memory, and the crimes committed then are still visible in the landscape around for the present generation of Israelis to behold and comprehend. On the Palestinian side, there are still victims living who can tell their story, and when they are gone, their descendants who have heard the tales of the 1948 horrors over and over again are likely to represent their point of view for generations to come. And of course, there are people in Israel who know exactly what they did, and there are even more who know what others did. Nevertheless, the Israeli authorities continue to succeed in eliminating these deeds totally from the society's collective memory, while struggling vigorously against anyone trying to shed light on the repulsive chapters of the 1948 history, whether inside or outside Israel. When one examines Israeli textbooks, curricula, media, and political discourse, one notices that this chapter in Jewish history, the chapter of expulsion, colonization, massacres, rape, and the burning of villages, is totally absent. In its stead, one finds chapters of heroism, glorious campaigns, and amazing tales of moral courage and military competence, unheard of in any other history of a people's liberation in the 20th century. Let us thus begin with a brief overview of the denied chapters of the history of 1948. Some of these chapters are also missing, thus, from the Palestinian collective memory. The two forms of amnesia stem, of course, from two very different ways of dealing with the past. Jewish Israelis are unwilling to acknowledge or be accountable for what happened in 1948, whereas the Palestinians, as a community of victims, have little appetite to revisit the trauma of the past. For such distinct reasons, popular memory on both sides and the failure of or unwillingness of professional historians to provide a true representation of the past have left us without a clear picture of the events of 1948. And I don't want to quote to you what I call the erased chapters. I hope you will see how they come out in this chapter. What I would like to quote again is from the end of this chapter, after I describe the development of the struggle against the 1948 events inside and outside Israel. I'm trying to assess where do we stand today with this memory of the horrible and criminal things that the Jewish state did to the indigenous people of Palestine. As I review the attempts I have made, I have been involved personally in the struggle against Nakba denial in Israel, and together with others have attempted to bring the Nakba onto the Israeli public agenda. A very mixed picture emerges. I detect serious cracks in the wall of denial and repression and that surrounds the issue of the Nakba in Israel, which have come about as a result of the debate of the new history in Israel and of the new political agendas of the Palestinians inside Israel. The new atmosphere has also been helped by a clarification of the Palestinian position on the refugee issue towards the end of the Oslo peace process. As a result, notwithstanding more than 50 years of systematic governmental suppression, it is becoming more and more difficult in Israel to deny the expulsion and the destruction of the Palestinians in 1948. However, this relative success has also brought with it two negative reactions, which were formulated after the outbreak of the Second Intifada in October 2000. The Israeli political establishment was the first to react. The Sharon government, through its Minister of Education, has undertaken the systematic removal of any textbook or school syllabus that refers to the Nakba even marginally. Similar instructions have been given to the public broadcasting authorities. The second reaction has been even more disturbing and has encompassed wider sections of the public. Although a very considerable number of Israeli politicians, journalists, and academics have ceased to deny what happened in 1948, they have nonetheless also been willing to justify it publicly, not only in retrospect, but also as a prescription for the future. Thus, the idea of transfer has entered Israeli political discourse openly for the first time, portraying population transfer as legitimate, being the most effective means of dealing with the Palestine problem. Indeed, if I were asked to sum up what best characterizes the current Israeli response to the Nakba, I would stress the growing popularity of the transfer option in the Israeli public mood and thought. The Nakba, the expulsion of the Palestinians from Palestine, now seems to many in the center of the political map in Israel as an inevitable and justifiable consequence of the Zionist project in Palestine. If there is any lament, it is that the expulsion was not completed. The fact that even an Israeli new historian, such as Benny Morris, now subscribes to the view that the expulsion was inevitable and should have been more comprehensive in 1948, helps to legitimize future Israeli plans for further ethnic cleansing. Population transfer is now the official moral option recommended by one of Israel's most prestigious academic centers, the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in Herzliya, which advises the government. It has appeared as a policy proposal in papers presented to the government by senior Labour Party ministers. It is openly advocated by university professors and media commentators, and very few now dare to condemn it, such as the Beersheba historian Professor Benny Morris and the Haifa historian Professor Yoav Gelber and Haifa University geography Professor Arnon Sofer in a direct manner, and in indirect manner by Professor Shlomo Avineri of the Hebrew University, who suggested the annexation of the Palestinian parts of Israel to a Palestinian state. And lately, even the leader, and that was written in 2005, before the Obama election, the leader of the majority of the United States House of Representatives has also openly endorsed this option. If this book is written, there is a new president in the White House. So far, the American policy has not produced any changes in previous approaches. The political scene in Israel has also remained much the same. Transferists such as Avigdor Lieberman hold key positions such as foreign minister, and frequent censuses indicates a growing support for transfer of Arabs from any part deemed Jewish in the land of Israel and Palestine. Thus, the circle is being closed almost before our very eyes. When Israel took almost 80% of Palestine in 1948, it did so through settlement and the ethnic cleansing of the original Palestinian population. The country now has a consensual government that enjoys wide public support and wants to determine by force the future of the remaining 20% of Palestine, namely the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. It has, as have all its predecessors, from Labour and Likud alike, resorted to settlement as the best means for doing that. This entails the destruction of an independent Palestinian infrastructure and other atrocities. These politicians sense, and they may not be wrong on this, that the public mood in Israel would allow them to go even further should they wish to do so. They could emulate the ethnic cleansing of 1948, this time not only by driving the Palestinians out of the occupied territories, but if necessary, also driving out the 1 million Palestinians living within the pre-1967 borders of Israel. In such an atmosphere, then, the Nakba is not so much denied in Israel as cherished. Nevertheless, the full story of 1948 needs to be told to the Israelis, as there may still be some among the state's population who are sensitive about the country's past and present conduct. This segment of the population should be alerted to the fact that horrific deeds were concealed from them about Israeli actions in 1948. And they should be told, too, that such deeds could easily now be repeated if they and others do not act to stop them before it's too late. The struggle against the denial of the Nakba in Israel is now the focus of the agenda of certain Palestinian groups, both inside and outside Israel. They are joined by the committed and impressive Jewish NGO Zochrot, struggling against Nakba denial in Israel. Since the 40th anniversary of the Nakba in 1988, the Palestinian minority in Israel has associated, in a way that it never did previously, its collective and individual memories of the catastrophe with the general Palestinian situation, and with their predicament in particular. This association has been manifested through an array of symbolic gestures, such as memorial services during Nakba Commemoration Day, organized tours to deserted or formerly Palestinian villages in Israel, seminars on the past, and extensive interviews with Nakba survivors in the press. Finally, because history teaches the Israelis the two things that I was trying to convey here, that they cannot always rely on American support, and they cannot really suppress the awful crime that they have committed against the Palestinian people, because they continue to commit the same crimes ever since, they feel, and I think this is behind what happened in Gaza in 2009, they feel that they have a very short window of opportunity to complete the Zionist ideal, because things can change either in the public opinion here in the United States or in the Palestinians' ability to react to the Israeli politics of dispossession and colonization. And I think behind this understanding motivated the brutality that was exercised against the Palestinian in Gaza in 2009. So for my share in the book, which is a bit different from the take that Noam Chomsky has on this, my take in the book is that you cannot understand what Israel did in Gaza without understanding what Israel did in 1948 and without understanding the immunity Israel enjoys in the Western world due mainly for the American support and endorsement of the Jewish state. So my particular chapter on Gaza is called The Killing Fields of Gaza. And let me end by reading from that chapter. The Gaza Strip is a little bit more than 2% of Palestine. This small detail is never mentioned whenever the Strip is in the news, nor has it been mentioned during the Israeli onslaught in Gaza in January 2009. Indeed, it is such a small part of the country that it never existed as a separate region in the past. Gaza's history before the Zionization of Palestine was not unique, and it was always connected administratively and politically to the rest of Palestine. It was until 1948 an integral part, a natural part of the country. As one of Palestine's principal land and sea gates to the rest of the world, it tended to develop in a more flexible and cosmopolitan way of life, not dissimilar to other gateways societies in the Eastern Mediterranean in the modern era. This location near the sea and on the Via Maris to Egypt and Lebanon brought with it prosperity and stability until this life was disrupted and nearly destroyed by the Israeli ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948. Between 1948 and 1967, Gaza became a huge refugee camp, restricted severely by the respective Israeli and Egyptian policies. Both states disallowed any movement out of the Strip. Living conditions were already harsh then, as the victims of the 1948 Israeli politics of dispossession doubled the number of the inhabitants who had lived there for centuries. On the eve of the Israeli occupation in 1967, the catastrophic nature of this enforced demographic transformation was evident all over the Strip. This once pastoral coastal part of southern Palestine became within 2 decades one of the world's densest areas of habitation without any adequate economic infrastructure to support it. The first 20 years of Israeli occupation allowed at least some movements outside the area that was closed off as a war zone in between the years 1948 and 1967. Tens of thousands of Palestinians were permitted to join the Israeli labor market as unskilled and underpaid workers. The price Israel demanded for this slave market was a total surrender of any national struggle or agenda. When this was not complied with, the gift of laborers' movement was denied and abolished. All those years leading to the Oslo Accord in 1993 were marked by an Israeli attempt to construct the Strip as an enclave, which the Israeli peace camp hoped would be either autonomous or part of Egypt, and the nationalist camp wished to include in the greater Eretz Israel they dreamt of establishing instead of Palestine. Namely, there was no voice inside Israel who wanted to see Gaza as an integral, organic, liberated part of a free Palestine. Even the most peacenik among the peace camps in Israel saw Gaza, long before the attack on Gaza, as a huge prison camp. The difference was that it was regarded as an open prison camp, not as a high security prison camp as it is regarded today. The Oslo Agreement enabled the Israeli to reaffirm the Strip's status as a separate geographical entity, not just outside of Palestine as a whole, but also cut off from the West Bank. Ostensibly, both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank were under the Palestinian Authority, the PA, but any human movement between them depended on Israel's goodwill, a rare Israeli trait, goodwill, that almost disappeared when Benjamin Netanyahu came to power in 1996. Moreover, Israel held, as it still does today, the water and electricity infrastructure. Since 1993, it used, or rather abused, this possession in order to ensure, on the one hand, the well-being of the Jewish settler community, and on the other, to blackmail the Palestinian population into submission and surrender. The people of the Gaza Strip thus facilitated, in the last 60 years, between being internees, hostages, or prisoners in an impossible human space. It is within this historical context that we should view the massacre that took place in January 2009 and the violence raging in Gaza in the preceding 5 years. The violence was not only meted out by Israeli forces. There was a fair share of inter-Palestinian fighting for a short while, although one should say that given the nature of the Israeli occupation and policy, this internal violence was far less than would be expected under such circumstances. But this internal phase is a minor aspect of a far more important issue, Israel violence against the Gaza Strip. When we look back from our current vantage point, we see more clearly that than ever before the fallacy of the Israeli discourse and justification for its actions in Gaza. Its politicians and diplomats define the policies against Gaza as a war against terror. I'm sure that sounds familiar to you. A war against terror, directed against a local branch of Al-Qaeda, and one that was meant to fend off a seditious Iranian penetration into this part of the world. Its academics prefer to depict Gaza as another arena in the dreaded clash of civilization. However, the origin of the particular violent history of the Gaza Strip lies elsewhere. The recent history of the Strip, 60 years of dispossession, occupation, and imprisonment, inevitably produced internal violence, such as we witnessed in the last few years, as it produced other unbearable features of life lived under such impossible conditions. In fact, if we take even a closer look at the 5 years preceding the caste-led operation, we can provide a sure analysis of the motivation for the violence directed against the Palestinians in 2009. There are two historical contexts for what happened in Gaza in January that year. One takes us back to the foundation of the State of Israel, through the occupation of the Strip by Israel in 1967 and up to the failed Oslo Accord in 1993. The second is the one presented here, an escalation of an Israeli policy that culminated with the events of 2009. The ideology of ethnic cleansing, adopted in 1948, is the main tool for implementing the dream of a safe and democratic Jewish state, led to the occupation of the Gaza Strip in 1967, which lasted until 2005, when Israel allegedly withdrew. The Gaza Strip was already encircled by an electric fence in 1994 as part of the preparation for peace with the Palestinians, and became a ghetto in 2000 when the peace process was declared dead. The decision of the people of Gaza to resist this closure by violent and non-violent means confronted the Israeli military and political elite with a new dilemma. They assumed that locking Gazans in a huge prison would settle the problem for a long while, but this turned out to be wrong. So they were looking for a new strategy. The bitter fruits of this strategy were revealed in January 2009, and the international community reacted furiously but ineffectively. The main byproduct of this international fury was the Goldstone report. It summarizes well, although in a very cautious and limited way, the scope of the carnage left by Israel after hostility subsided. The international community, however, did not inquire why such a ruthless policy was pursued and what were its immediate origins. If I have still more time, 2 minutes? 3 minutes, okay. What I would like to do is, I think I would like to do this, is to read from the very end of the book, and just, if it concluded the book, it might be a good concluding for this reading session. After describing the 5 years, unfortunately I don't have time to go into it, the different Israeli operations against the people of Gaza under the pretext that these were retaliations against Palestinian action, I come back to the Goldstone report and the Israeli attacks on Gaza, and I did what many friends of mine were very unhappy with. And I decided in a very lucid way, as far as I was concerned at least, without any ambiguity, to call the Israeli policies in Gaza genocide and not just ethnic cleansing, which was very difficult for many people, but I thought was the right way of doing it. So let me just read a small, short extract on this, and with this we'll end the reading. The evidence collected by Israeli-based human rights organizations, international agencies, the media, although the Israeli barred the media from entering the Gaza Strip, was perceived by many to be far more serious than just war crimes. Some refer to it as a genocide. It is not often that the President of the United Nations General Assembly would accuse a member state of genocide. But when the Israeli army bombarded the civilian populations of Gaza, invoking the right of self-defense against terrorists launching missiles into civilian targets, Miguel de Acosta Brockman did not hesitate to describe such actions as genocide. As a former Roman Catholic priest and Nicaragua's foreign ministers, his views carry considerable weight. Needless to say, these remarks were promptly dismissed by the Israelis as anti-Semitic, the standard reaction to such accusations. Had his voice been a lonely one in the wilderness, it would have had little resonance. But he was joined by similar expressions of outrage by other senior politicians, especially outside the Western corridors of power, who chose the term genocide as the only way to describe the tragedy visited upon the people of Gaza. The cost of Brockman's reaction came before the full-scale destruction of homes, schools, and hospitals in many parts of Gaza. A week later, the Turkish columnist and author Oktay Akbal described the Israeli actions as the real genocide. The Israeli daily Haaretz reported on December the 29th, 2008, that government and opposition leaders across the globe, but mainly the Southeast Asia, Africa, and South America, referred to the atrocities, even before they fully transpired, as genocide. There was strong criticism from the West as well, but these sources were more cautious in using the term genocide. Nonetheless, the G word frequently surfaced in the commentaries conveyed through alternative media, bloggers, and websites. Even before the Gaza operation in January 2009, occasional references were made to Israeli armed forces committing acts of genocide. The January 2009 events were referred to in similar terms by the pro-Western Arab media. One such source was the Dubai-based satellite network Al Arabiya. On December the 28th, 2008, when the massive Israeli killing had just begun, although already resulting in unprecedented numbers of dead children and women, the network reported the popular protests around the world against the Israeli reactions. The headline was, "World's Tents United Against Genocide in Gaza." This was not the mainstream media's opinion in the West, nor was it voiced in such a manner by any members of the political elite in North America or Europe. But within the balance of power between hegemonic and counter-hegemonic voices, the latter included senior politicians in the rest of the world, the widest coalitions of the political left and human rights organizations in the West, coupled with some influential voices from within the Western media. One can understand why Judge Goldstone refrained from such language. His report, as noted, corroborates the evidence collected by those who describe these policies as genocidals, but sums them up as war crimes that require further investigation. Goldstone's report also uses the same language for the Hamas missile attack on Israel. This seems to be more lip service than a genuine point. The imbalance of the aggressor's power and destruction and the victim's pathetic military response deserves different language. Moreover, when one reads the thorough and brave report of Judge Goldstone, one should remember that the 1,500 killed, thousands of wounded, and tens of thousands who lost their homes do not tell the whole story. It is the decision to employ such fierce military force in a civilian space that should be discussed. This kind of firepower can only produce the kind of horrific destruction we have seen in Gaza. It was used for this purpose. The nature of the military operation also displayed an Israeli military wish to experiment with new weapons, all intended to kill civilians as part of what the former chief of the Army's General Staff, Moshe Ya'alon, termed as the need to brand in the Palestinian consciousness the fearsome might of the Israeli army. Thank you.
A series called the Lannan Cultural Freedom Lecture Series here in Santa Fe. And I'm not sure exactly where we're going to have all the events. Some may be here, some may be at the School for the Deaf, some may be at the Armory of the Arts, and some may be at the Lenzing, depending on the subject and the speaker. And I just want to mention we're going to cover things like economic issues, which are on everybody's mind today. Corporate graft, government corruption, human rights, civil liberties, the militarization of our foreign policy, environmental issues, immigration, Islamophobia. I'm just trying to go through we're putting this all together now. Various Native American issues, global food issues, things like targeted assassination programs. And all the constitutional connections with that. Things, we're going to talk about public education, corporate-controlled media. I think hopefully it founded the nonprofit Voices of a People History of the United States, which is an effort to bring the program and the productions into the school systems in the United States and other parts of the world. So please join me in welcoming Anthony Arnov, your host.
Thank you, Patrick, and thanks to everyone from the Lannan Foundation. It's been such a privilege to work with the Lannan Foundation and to have the opportunity to work with them on a number of programs. I owe them a lot, including my current relationship comes out of a Lannan event with Arundhati Roy in New York City in the year, I guess it was 2003. It's really no exaggeration to say there's no other foundation, even remotely like the Lannan Foundation, in terms of the voices they've supported, the courageous positions they've taken, and the kind of support that they've given to Haymarket Books, which...
It'll be an interesting series, and there'll be a lot of interest in the community. All of the events will be videotaped, and will be up on our website within about a week, and we'll offer them to iTunes and any other organization or website that wants to see them. So you're all welcome when it starts. And I think we'll be able to make some announcements, more specific announcements about the initial events in January sometime. So stay tuned. Haymarket Books is is a nonprofit progressive book distributor and publisher, and their name and their inspiration comes from their namesakes, the Haymarket Martyrs. You can see their memorial in Chicago. In 1886, there was a big struggle for the 8-hour day, and ultimately May Day, which is celebrated in many parts of the world, not so much here, came out of that struggle and those deaths. You know, these same struggles are continuing today across the globe against oppression and exploitation, hunger, poverty, all the things that, you know, you're familiar with from reading the papers and listening to the news. I also want to mention that Haymarket books are going to be some books. I'm Patrick Lannan from the Lannan Foundation, and better keep my glasses on. I have a little script here. It's not too well organized, but I want to thank all of you for coming tonight, and I want to say that it's a pleasure for us to be able to do co-sponsor an event with Haymarket Books, and I'll tell you why in a second. I'd also like to take advantage of the fact that well, first, I don't want to forget, there are people here from Taos. Where are they? Good going. Thanks for coming. In Albuquerque, there's a... Wow. Thank you all. It's really great to have you. I'm going to use this occasion because you're all here to tell you that the foundation's going to start. Are going to be for sale outside at the end of this event. And also there's an interesting catalog of their books that'll be available. Now, I have to say something nice about Anthony Arnove, who is an associate of ours and a wonderful person. Anthony recently directed and produced The People Speak with Howard Zinn, Chris Moore, Josh Brolin, and Matt Damon. And I don't know how many people have seen the film yet, the documentary, but it's really quite incredible. This documentary is a film companion to Howard Zinn's best-selling book, A People's History of the United States, and its primary source, which is The Voices of People's History, which Arnove co-edited with Zinn, Zirin. And he himself has written several books, including The Essential Chomsky, Iraq Under Siege, The Deadly Impact of Sanctions and Terrorism and War, and he also edited a collection of post-9/11 interviews with Zinn. He's also the author of Iraq, The Logic of Withdrawal. He is also on the editorial board of Haymarket Books and the International Socialist Review magazine. And with Zinn, he